In these little videos in this week, we're looking at the consequences of conversion of Constantine and what that means for the church. And in this little video, we're looking at asceticism and the birth of monasticism. There's a story about Mother Theresa visiting London during the time of Margaret Thatcher. Theresa herself was, of course, famous for giving up a normal life and dedicating her time as a nun and living alongside the poor, lepers, the abandoned and so on in Calcutta. There she was in 1980s London, an official and honoured guest of the state, and it's said that during a public walkabout with the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, who was herself an icon of individualistic capitalism, Theresa stopped on the guided trail, took Margaret Thatcher by the hand and led her off the designated route down a side alley to where there were some homeless people sheltering underneath a bridge. It was a deeply symbolic act and an implicit criticism of the way that conservatism was somehow missing something. Now, we are often used to thinking that the accumulation of wealth and possessions equals power and influence. And you know, it's largely true. Bill Gates has more power than I do. But in exceptional cases, this equation can be subverted, turned upside down. Asceticism, which comes from the Greek to exercise, asceticism refers to spiritual power that comes from giving up wealth. Paradoxically, it brings about a form of power that's more moral. After the conversion of Constantine and the flow of money and power into the church, there arose a problem. How could the church remain authentic to itself? How could the office of priests and bishops avoid simply becoming a subsidised arm of the state, a form of Roman civil service? And bear in mind that the word diocese that we use for church organisation is simply the basic unit of Roman administration. Well, one way the church did this was for individuals to give up the trappings of wealth, to invent asceticism. We can see the earliest stirrings of this from the 300s, so just before Constantine converts, initially in Egypt and in Syria, where individuals begin to retreat to the edges of settlements, away from the cities which have become wealthy and a little bit corrupt, to live lives instead of prayer and self-discipline, doing battle with the temptations to sin within themselves and around them, and with the power of the devil. These early individuals would often live in caves or former tombs, and as they were mostly acting on their own, these hermits were known as monks, from the Greek monos, or single, or alone, monks. The most famous of them is Anthony of Alexander. Here he is on the screen. But there are two paradoxes in the arrival of this hermit monasticism. First, in order to give up wealth, you probably have had to have it from the start. And it becomes a little bit clear when we look at the stories of these early monks that many of them aren't your average Christian. Quite a few of them come from relatively wealthy urban backgrounds. In a world in which there are no longer any martyrs and in which the church is awash with money and increasingly involved with politics of the state, many moneyed Roman Christians discovered this desire for authenticity. You could, I guess, call it a desire for revival. Most famously, we can see something of that interior dilemma going on within the publication of a man called Augustine, his Confessions. It's a great book and well worth a read. The Confessions show us a very well-educated, wealthy, urban Roman young man, all set for a successful career as a lawyer or a regional governor, pondering what it means to be an authentic Christian. And his conclusion is that it involves returning to evangelical simplicity, to poverty. The first paradox about asceticism, then, is that behind it there's often a strange relationship with money. And this continues throughout the history of the Church. The same paradox is visible in the 12th century with the birth of the mendicant orders, the Franciscans and Dominicans, Mendicant means to beg. Recall, St. Francis is the son of a wealthy cloth merchant. He's not born a beggar. The Franciscan movement emerges among what you could say are relatively urban, wealthy Italian middle-class people who are jaded with money. And in the same way today, new monasticism, I might suggest, is most popular among fairly wealthy middle-class young people who are jaded by hyper-consumerism and who yearn for simplicity and authenticity. Similarly, in the Roman Catholic Church, it takes the riches and corruption of the Vatican's own bank to create a pope who wants to call himself Francis. Money and asceticism often go hand in hand, the latter as a reaction. The second paradox is that although these monk hermits on the surface look like they're cutting themselves off from society, many of them actually are highly attractive social figures to whom people flock. They have a kind of charisma about themselves which gives them power. In a Roman world that believed in the presence of curses, evil spirits flying around and capriciousness of the gods, these living martyrs, as they were considered, could become extremely influential as sources of power. The most famous of them are, of course, the Stylites, the pole sitters. Simon Stylites, here he is on the screen, sat on a pillar outside the city of Aleppo in Syria for 37 years, doing battle with the devil. This is a 6th century image. Simon quickly became an object of interest. He was seen by many Roman Syrians in his region as an impartial adjudicator to whom they could come to for decisions. After all, he was ultimately unbribable. He was also seen as someone obviously close to God, even physically so. The Stylites and other holy men and women took on a social function in a society in which the vast majority of people had no access to the wealthy and the powerful. These holy figures became patrons who ordinary Christians could call upon, who in turn could help them access power, mediate for them in disputes, shame authorities into changing policies. So Simon and other ascetics came to wield enormous charismatic power in the Roman Church. But note, just as in the case of the cult of dead martyrs in the previous video, these living martyrs, these saints, were also initially outside of the control of the bishops. As a layperson, anyone can approach God through them without using the role of the sacraments or the churches. Naturally, the church was rather wary of the rise of ascetics like this. And so what did the bishops do? Well, of course, from the 380s onwards, they joined them. One of the earliest of them is St. Martin of Tours in France. Martin was initially a soldier, a rather charismatic individual, who earned his fame by abandoning the military and rejecting its power. He was elevated to become the local bishop of Tours by the population, much to the consternation of his wealthy neighbours, his wealthy episcopal neighbours that is, who by that time were all drawn from senatorial families. But then soon we find other bishops beginning to copy him. People who had grown up in well-connected wealthy families start shedding their silk clothes for scratchy rags. They get rid of their nice couches and they sleep on beds of straw. They open up their villas to become monasteries for other hermits. Notice they kind of redirect their wealth rather than getting rid of it entirely. Many of these monastic bishops did so after an earlier successful career, maybe after they'd been widowed, although some married bishops did embrace celibacy too. Often their wives would become nuns. So just as with the cult of martyrs in the previous video, bishops catch up with this popular interest in charismatic asceticism by bringing it into the church. A further stage of this is the birth of what's called cenobitic monasticism. Cenobitic means common life or life in community. Remember, initially these monks lived alone, hence the name monos, monk. But for practical reasons they began to live closer to one another, and soon there became movements of monks choosing to live in community, who understood the aim of their life not as solitary spiritual battle, but instead as a communal activity of prayer, praise and study. And there were various experiments in monastic community, each of them under the rule of a charismatic father or mother figure. The word abbot is word father in Aramaic. The most famous of these, of course, and the most successful, was Benedictine monasticism. Benedict, who died maybe in 547, gathered a community east of Rome at a place called Monte Cassino. In many ways he was personally unsuccessful. He was once even poisoned by his own monks. Though it's not entirely certain that he actually wrote it, a rule survived which is linked to his name, the Benedictine rule, that provided a ready-made template for how other monastic communities should live. The word rule comes from the Latin regula, something that keeps you marking time or marks distance. A rule regularizes the behaviour of the monks. It specifies times of prayer, in his case 7 of them, what you should do when you pray. You should use the Psalms. You should do all of them each week and from memory. And it tells you what you should study, in particular how later you should use Lectio Divina, slow meditative chewing over of the Bible to find hidden, sometimes allegorical truth in it. But the rule also gives very basic job descriptions that a monastic community would need: an abbot, a guest master, a cellarer to look after the supplies, and so on. Benedict, or whoever wrote his rule, didn't write it from fresh. It's actually based on a number of earlier sources, in particular a rule of the master, rather a nasty document. And what it reveals is how gentle Benedict was, toning down the rather strident view of what monasticism was about. Benedict instead imagines that monasticism is a gentle school for the Lord's service. And to join a monastery for him is to slowly have the edges knocked off of you as you learn to live in community with others, praying regularly, studying, working, giving hospitality, and growing in virtue. On its own, the rule of St. Benedict has much to commend it. But what really helped it win out as a franchise, and I think we should think of Benedictinism as a very successful brand, what really helped it was given papal endorsement. Half a century after he died, a pope named Gregory the Great, himself a monk, popularised the rule by publishing a biography of Benedict, and he spread the rule around Western Europe. Benedictine monasteries eventually became extremely wealthy places, because if a monk is a kind of spiritual warrior, and you happen to be a wealthy aristocrat who lives nearby, you might want to give some money to that spiritual warrior and ask him or her to pray for you. You might want to patronise their communities with gifts of land. And inevitably this meant that huge amounts of money and then corruption and popular resentment came to surround monasteries. In part, the Franciscan revival I just mentioned was a revolt against how tied up with wealth monasteries had become. Some much later popular support for the Reformation would draw on this hatred of monasteries and their corruption. In the earliest legends of Robin Hood, his enemy is not the Sheriff of Nottingham, it's the Abbot of St Mary's Abbey in York, who's utterly corrupt and who has to have the wealth stolen from and given to the poor. But on the plus side, monasteries could also become centres of learning. They produced the first schools, they spread literacy, they became islands of stability, preserving manuscripts of Roman and Greek learning, whilst all around the Roman Empire gradually collapsed and the so-called Dark Age arrived. Monasteries also produced the earliest hospitals. Indeed, the word hospital comes from the Benedictines' rule to give hospitality. And as many of the guests arrived sick, monasteries began to care for them. They became sources of medicine. So notice what happened. A spontaneous charismatic movement, initially on the margins of the church, reacting against wealth and power, is slowly sucked in to become part of the mainstream. Like so many cool, hip, revolutionary trends, it becomes the new norm. You might want to pause at the end of this video and ask yourself some questions. Does the church still need ascetics or asceticism or monasteries? Why? If so, how and in what form? Again, this will be something you'll be discussing in your seminar groups.